Well, how you doing, Lance? I'm delighted that you're joining us. And let me just tell our viewers, Lance and I go back a long way. I mean, maybe not quite as long as a couple of other people like Tom Cooper, who we might talk about a tiny bit later on. But actually, Lance is responsible for me coming to Fordham University. I guess it was in 1998. And shortly after that, pretty much after the first day when I barely got into my office, maybe just a few days after that, Lance invited me to join him in his office. And that's how the Media Ecology Association came to be. If I'm not mistaken, there were four or five of us at that meeting. But in addition to being a friend and a colleague, Lance is also a very prolific author. He has published poetry. He has a whole very significant series of books. And what we're here to talk about today is this book. And if you can't see it this clearly in this video, don't worry, I'm going to have a nice big image of the book at the end. So, why don't we start by your telling me and our audience what moves you to write this book?
Well, obviously, masochism is what moves us to write anything. Uh, but I've been trying to put together a number of books. I think, I know some people kind of run out of ideas, but, for me, I think it's going to be more running out of time than anything. But we publish, as you know, Paul, I'm also the president of the Institute of General Semantics, and the IGS publishes books. I mean, they did originally, and back some almost 2 decades ago, I started up restarted their publishing, and then have since published. This is the fourth book I've published with the IGS, and as a not for profit, I was a 401c3PO, whatever, uh, corporation. I don't take any royalties from the books I publish with the IGS. They all go back to the Institute. Um, and so I had the idea. I mean, really, I've got a few things that I want to do with the IGS. I mean, some things I do outside of the IGS, but this was one of them, and it brings together some pieces that are about general semantics along with media ecology, because they're never separate for me. So it's Korzybski, it's McLuhan, it's Neil Postman. They're always intertwined, at least in my work.
Well, that leads actually to one of my questions, and it's very, very apparent in the book that you are very interested in, have done a lot of work in both of these fields, and they are obviously related. And in the media ecology program at NYU that we both got our PhDs from, we did learn about Korzybski in the larger context of media ecology.
Mhm.
But knowing you as well as I know you, you have shifted to some extent from media ecology per se to, at the very least, paying at least as much, if not more, attention to general semantics. And of course, as you point out in your book, that's not to say there's an opposition at all between the two. They do complement each other. But what I'm interested in, and likely at least some of our viewers and listeners, what led you to make that evolution from media ecology per se to general semantics?
Well, it doesn't feel that way to me per se, but and first of all, I would say they're not like two sort of equivalent kinds of things, in a way that, for me, media ecology is a wide open field and an approach, so that lots of things fit into media ecology, like systems theory and information theory and urban studies, to some extent with Lewis Mumford, for example. There are all these different pieces that, literary studies connect into it. Um, so, in the same way, general semantics connects into it as well. And as you mentioned, I mean, it was very important for Postman and for the Postman's media ecology program, including the fact that he was editing the General Semantics Journal, et cetera, for a decade, and many folks like yourself and Joshua Meyerowitz and Christine Nystrom and Jay Rosen. I mean, they were all like kind of had like a little editorial, whatever review editor, contributing editor roles with, et cetera. And many of us published our articles in, et cetera, back then. Um, so I wouldn't say it really is this big radical shift. Obviously, since I've been working with general semantics, and some of that goes back to, about 15 or more, close to 2 decades ago. Um, and, so it has me re-examine some things that, I realize fit in and are very significant. So, if you look at my book on media ecology from 2017, Media Ecology, Subtitle, An Approach to Understanding the Human Condition. And now there's one section where I go over a lot of different intersections with media ecology, and one of them is general semantics, and it's like about 2 pages. But if you look throughout the book, there's lots of references that go back to Korzybski or general semantics, because it gives us a way to think about things and to think about definitions, to think about about environments and in ecology, and of course to think about language and perception. I say general semantics is has a narrower kind of focus, because and the tradition there is to refer to it as a discipline where you learn a very specific set of tools that you can then use to better understand anything that you're dealing with, and it's enormously helpful. So it's fun to play with it. But I've always had an interest in language, for example, and this just brings it a bit more to the fore.
Yeah, I was just going to get into that. Media ecology obviously studies all kinds of communications. And, apropos of the importance of McLuhan in understanding media in the Gutenberg galaxy, you have everything, probably even including the kitchen sink, you know, discussed as a medium of something. As long as I've known you, and apropos of your interest in poetry, you have always had a special interest in language, in words, in that kind of way of expressing ourselves. So I'm interested in, what do you think led to that, or is that something you've had ever since you've been a kid, or?
I guess so. Um, Although my mother wrote my first poem because I came home, it was like an assignment, I don't know, in the first grade maybe, and I just didn't know. I said I don't, I didn't know how to do it. So she said, "Well, how about this?" And I said, "Oh yeah, okay." Um, but I mentioned this, I think, in some other books, but at some point, much later on, I was looking through some of the childhood books that I had, and there was one, I'm sure you had this too. Remember the Scholastic Book Fairs? That we would have, at least in the New York City public schools, and there'd be, your mom would give you money, or your dad, and come in, and you'd be able to buy some books that were published by Scholastic. And there was one that I think it was called What's in a Word. And it was about language. It was about the history of language in English, and what a symbol is. And there even was like a page on writing and the alphabet, and another page on printing. And I just went back and looked at it, and it was like, oh my God, my interest, related to media ecology, goes back to elementary school, and I didn't even realize it. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And your interest in language is a greater interest than any other person that I actually know in media ecology in any field. Let's get
You
back.
need to meet some more people, I
I
think.
do. I lead a very sheltered life. Uh, I'm trying to remember S.I. Hayakawa obviously was an important person in general semantics. He was a senator for a while from the state of California. I think he fell asleep at one point. There's like
He
an
had a bit of narcolepsy, as I
yeah,
understood it.
the poor guy. So what I'm trying to remember, did Neil Postman, our teacher in media ecology, did he ever have Hayakawa at any of the media ecology conferences? I don't think any that I attended. What about you?
No, no. Um, and you may know, I mean, he did work with Hayakawa for 1 year. Postman's first academic post was San Francisco State in the late 50s. And I think Hayakawa may have been his department chair. It was an English department. And remember his anecdote because, as we know, I mean, Hayakawa turned into a kind of right-wing Republican. And he said the last sensible thing he ever heard Hayakawa say, Postman asked Hayakawa, how could you call in the National Guard on students? And Hayakawa answered, they're not students, they're lawbreakers.
Well, that's a good way of justifying that. At least it had a logic to it,
Right.
which current
Yeah.
right-wing Republicans don't seem to much care about. Let's get into some of the content of not A, not B, E, and C. One of the things that struck me, and it's not the most pleasant topic to talk about, obviously, but it's certainly a very profound topic, is the importance you place beginning in the first chapter, but really throughout the book in negativity and the things that you say about negativity. And most people at some point or another, if they've had any introduction to media studies and what they today call media archaeology,
Ugh.
know the importance of zero, which the ancient Romans didn't have. And when you tell someone, try to do division through
Mhm.
Roman numerals, they might actually try it and not know where to go or what to do. And the only way they can possibly do it is if they translate the Roman numerals in their mind into Arabic numerals, and that's how you can, do
Sure.
division. But what got you so interested in negativity? And let me say, I realize, and again, I think this was in the first chapter, when you were first talking about negativity, that in a way, alternate history, and in particular my alternate history book, It's Real Life, it is another way of getting at negativity. In other words, I was so moved by the fact that John Lennon ceased to exist that my
Mm.
way of dealing with it is to, write a story and then a novel in which he did exist. So, I mean, would you say, because I think you do actually come close to saying this, animals, even the most intelligent animals, although who really knows with orangutans and great apes, et cetera, they don't seem to have any kind of sense of negativity. They may get upset when something
Right.
is missing, but we're the ones who abstract it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's the idea that negation is a very abstract concept. So, if you're asked to picture negation, there's nothing to picture. I mean, literally nothing to picture, but you can't, right? You can't draw a picture of nothing because a picture has to be something. And even the kind of icon we use for not, which is the circle with the cross running through it, is not a picture of something, right? So it is more of a kind of linguistic substitute of an icon rather than a picture, an image that resembles something in reality. And this is George Lakoff's famous exercise where he says to students, close your eyes now, don't think of an elephant. right? And the point being that it's impossible to not think of an elephant. In fact, you end up thinking of an elephant. Um, which speaks politically to his view that, that even where someone like Trump, for example, gets all this negative publicity, that still is more powerful than uh, you know because we're talking about him, and that it's impossible to really be negative by invoking somebody. Um, but yeah, so the idea that is that it really isn't kind of abstraction to think of zero, to think of nothing, the null set in mathematics, and that is not possible without language, that language is what gives us that ability. And I think one of the great moments in that is if you can remember back to being around 2 years old, or if you've observed 2-year olds, the moment that they learn the word no, they go crazy. It's like no, 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 and it is like this moment where you've really like bumped up into the symbolic world. Now, you might say, well, I've got a dog and I go no, and it responds, but it responding not to the word no, but to the tone of voice. And and with it the gesture and facial expression and all of that. They can't conceive of zero, of nothingness, of the null set. And in a way, the null set, if we think of it in set theory, the null set speaks to the set in its entirety, whereas individual members of the set are inside the set. The null set is the set itself. It speaks to the set itself, which is a level up. It's meta, and that's more abstract.
Absolutely. A couple of points on that or responses to it. One, if we take what you're saying literally, and there's no reason really why we shouldn't, because I think literally it is true, then we come to the conclusion that there's no such thing as bad publicity, right? And that would go along with Lakoff's point, which
Yeah.
is precisely Trump's point. I mean, Trump actually has expressed that. Uh,
Hmm.
as a matter of fact, I think I told you this. Someone wrote a book on Trump like in 2003, 2004, and I don't know why called me and interviewed me. And the only quote that survived from the long conversation I had, and I didn't say really too many negative things about Trump because I actually found him an interesting figure. And
Yeah.
but the main point I made, which appears in the book, is Trump's firm belief that the worst publicity is no publicity,
Hmm.
or there's no such thing as bad publicity. Those two things are
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
same. And of course, but nonetheless, I mean, this is an interesting point. If you follow it through, you still feel bad when somebody says something bad about you. I mean, I don't really know a single person, certainly including me. If I
Hmm.
get like a review that says this is the worst book I've ever read, I got it for nothing, and I'm still worse off. I didn't pay anything for it. Forget about the money. That review might well attract attention, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, and therefore get more people to read my book, which is what I want. But nonetheless, I still don't like it.
Sure.
And so, I mean, and this gets into Karl Popper, who you also talk about in the book. But so, what are we to make about this? Popper argues, as you know, that basically the only way we can progress with our knowledge is to have at least a part of our knowledge in some way be negated or
Yeah.
proven wrong.
Yeah.
But yet, it's no pleasure when your theory is proven wrong.
Sure.
So I guess we live in a world of people, and maybe even the most successful people in terms of the growth of knowledge, who got to be that way by having the quote pleasure unquote of having their ideas proven wrong. So maybe we shouldn't worry so much about being right. It's okay to be wrong. Would you
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what they tell us in research is that negative results are are, can be very significant, that when you disprove your hypothesis rather than prove it, that is still a contribution to knowledge. But we're human beings, and so we respond to negative comments and negative publicity and rejection. Um, that's absolutely the case. But yeah, I mean, in truth, we respond even more drastically to being ignored. And that's where, again, growing up, I mean, that's where you get the idea of acting out. It's like he wants attention. But that comes from not getting attention. That it is more devastating to be ignored or to get the silent treatment or just, to be treated as if you don't exist than to get, negative feedback, because the meta level again, on that is, uh, whatever feedback you get, it's recognizing your existence, recognizing you as a person, whereas being ignored and not getting any feedback is denying your existence, and that's more devastating ultimately.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess it's true that hate is more likely to be a conduit to love than just total ignorance, having
Apathy.
loss of it. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Apathy is the worst thing. I don't know if you ever saw this album cover. You know who Phil Oakes was? Does that name?
sure.
Okay, good. In many ways, by the way, I think
I
his.
am much younger than you, but I do know who Phil Oakes is.
Well, good. I'm glad. No, but he deserves more attention than he gets. His song, "The Crucifixion," I think, is one of the most brilliant analyses. And actually, in a way, now that I think about it, it relates to what we're talking about. That people's fans, people who followers, people who love, and build up people. Part of that process is they live for the time when that person gets what we would today say canceled, torn down,
Mm.
and and that's a pretty horrific thing to think about. That wrapped up in any love of a movie star is the desire to see that person fall off that pedestal. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I mean that was Phil Oakes's way of trying to explain.
Well,
Uh,
that's been said generally about heroes.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It and in particular the almost morbid interest that to this very day people have in, well, how exactly was John F. Kennedy killed? And I want to know where like every fragment of his skull landed, and so on. Let's move on to a happier topic.
Oh, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. Let's get back to your poetry because as you know, I'm not a poet, but I'm a songwriter to some extent. And you, in contrast, are a poet, but as far as I know, not a songwriter. And although maybe I'm wrong about that, you can correct me. But I guess what I would like to know, and this is implicit in this book, and it's also even more explicit in other books and things that you've said. What got you to focus on poetry rather than song lyrics?
Well, first of all, I'll correct you that I did write a whole bunch of songs when I was in my 20s. And, I played a kind of rudimentary guitar to go along with them. I think I've got a cassette tape that I recorded somewhere. I don't know where. Maybe someday I'll find it and, you know, uh, but, at a certain point, I got older. I stopped playing guitar for a long time and just forgot how to play the songs. And I don't know if I ever wrote down the lyrics. I guess I probably did, but I don't know where it happened to it. So basically, for a lot of it is just sort of vanished into the ether or into piles of stuff that need to be dug through. Um, and I mean, as a fellow baby boomer, although of a much later part of the boom than you, um, that are one of the sort of dreams or fantasies is to be a rock star, and that was something that I was interested in, but never really knew how to do or had the wherewithal to pursue very far. Um, and in the meantime, I got into doing academic stuff. Actually, when I was working on my PhD, in my later 20s, I also dabbled in some comedy writing, but the same kind of thing. We just, had a group, we wrote a whole bunch of skits. We wanted to be the next Monty Python. And there was no YouTube back then. There was nothing, no outlet to really did it. We did like one thing in a public access station in Metuchen, New Jersey one time, and it just didn't go anywhere. So yeah, so at a much later point, you were the one who got me into first doing a blog, and then joining MySpace back when it was the social network. And after a while there, not really knowing what to do, someone directed me to the people writing poetry and doing poetry blogs on MySpace. And I said, oh, I could do that. And it kind of reawakened that impulse in me. Uh, you know, and then I did a whole lot of stuff there.
I'm so glad you said that. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the person to blame for Lance's poetry. Well, no, I'm glad. I'm glad I had that influence
It
on you.
was Vogon. I started it out as Vogon poetry, yes, and you're to blame.
Absolutely. I remember the conversation where we talked about, hey, I was saying, blog is a good thing. You don't pay anything for
Yeah.
it. You get your work out there, and actually, I wasn't by any means the first person, to have. I don't think I even started my blog until 2006. So, there were people like 1999,
Oh, sure.
2001 who were doing blogs. Let's switch to another point. As I was reading your book, I want to tell you about the one paradox that I've come up with, and I think it fits in with some of the ideas in not A, not B, and C. So I'll tell you the paradox, and then you can tell me and our audience how you would assess it. Here's the paradox: you can't make a duplicate of a unique object.
Right.
Because hey, I'm copying it exactly as it is, but once you get it to be 100% correct, you've robbed it of its uniqueness.
Well,
The,
that's sort of by definition, but by extension, you can't have a duplicate of anything because everything in the universe is, any phenomenon is a unique event in space-time.
okay, so as soon as you make it, even if it's not one object, even if you have 20 objects and you make a 21st object, you're changing. You're changing the nature of the universe, but you're not destroying anything unique about those 20 objects, except maybe the trivial fact that uh, now they're not just 20, they're 21. But if you take something which is truly unique and you
Yeah.
somehow figure out how to duplicate it exactly, you've then robbed it of its uniqueness.
Well, that's true, but I would just, from a scientific perspective, no two objects, no matter how similar, would ever really be identical to one another. And that, since we're bringing it up, I mean, that's the fundamental bottom line negation in general semantics is non-identity, the principle of non-identity. There is no identity relationships in nature, or there are no, I should say, identity relationships in nature, and nothing's identical to itself because at any, however time passes, however we measure it from time one to time two, there's been some change. We're talking even, submolecular quantum level. I mean, nothing is the same from one moment to the next.
All right, but look, you've probably heard this is an example, of, in fact, I have like this file in my head, things that Trump did right. So you probably heard the other day he's doing away with the penny because it costs 3 cents to mint up a penny. In fact,
Right.
I think they should do away with nickels and even dimes. You can't get anything for them
Yes.
anymore. Right.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. If we imagine a situation, somebody is minting out pennies, they haven't been into circulation, which obviously is going to make differences. But wouldn't you agree at the instant that those pennies are minted up and come off the assembly line or whatever the minting process is, those pennies are identical?
No, I mean, as a physical object, each penny is in some way different from every other, each one is unique, I mean, in terms of its molecular structure, I mean, do they have the exact same atoms or, um, they're just going to all have their individual differences. And from one moment to another, like electrons fly off, others come in, I mean, when we understand that, and this is where following the path that Korzybski himself took, which was to start with this Einstein's revolution in physics, and the idea that nothing is permanent, nothing's stable, everything is a process, everything, reality is a dynamic set of events. So no, now you could say each one is worth a penny, and that's when we've shifted into the symbolic realm. So we can say that 1 + 1 = 2, but you can't take that, that very abstract concept of quantity and then say that, one chair is the same as another chair, one penny is the same as another penny, one person's the same as the other person. And that's where, one of the chapters, and maybe you were trying to bring this up, but I'll bring it up.
Yeah.
One of the chapters, and the longest chapter actually is on, the the whole problem of the word is and the verb to be, because of its implication that you can have that sort of equal relationships, that relationships of equality, of identity, that really do not exist in reality. We can have them symbolically, but when we try to, when that colors our expectations and we expect everything to be, to fit into that, then it creates massive problems in the way that we relate to the world.
Okay, so let's though examine this a little more carefully because I am very interested in this. So you're saying that even though two things, be they pennies, be they vaccines, whatever, however controversial or non-controversial you want to make
Yeah.
them, uh, it's just a human convenience that makes us think that they're the same, but saying they're the same or equal is just a shorthand that covers up some inescapable inequalities in those things.
Right. Yeah, and you can say for all intents and purposes, they're equal or they're interchangeable, but that sooner or later brings leads to difficulties, leads to problems. And if we're not aware and thinking about the fact of non-identity, um, we don't know what to do with that. And it's perfectly fine to go through, ordinary situations, treating things as if they're the same. But as long as we have in mind that, that is contingent on, whatever it is we're doing, the situation, and that when we run into difficulties, especially, or you need a creative way, creative problem solving or new way of thinking about things, that's where non-identity really comes into play. But it is the fundamental principle in general semantics.
Well, it's an interesting principle. I mean, and I think it has a lot of good consequences. In other words, racism basically feeds on the fact that you identify an undesirable group, and everyone in that group is exactly the same and should all be excluded. So,
Yes.
and there are many, many examples of how sameness, undermines good things in the human condition.
Yeah. When you think about, racism or any kind of stereotyping, I mean, there are, one is, treat me as an individual, right? Don't treat me like a member of the group. I'm not the same as other people. I mean, and and of course, we understand that people who are not being stereotyped and people who are considered like real or normal are treated as individuals, whereas the minority group that's being stereotyped, they're treated like they're all the same. Um, so, part of it is bring it down a level. But also, as you say, we're not interchangeable. We're all different, just like you're all different. And then what happens is that we abstract out a certain characteristics, human characteristics, and ignore others. So any population, any group of people will have some individuals who are highly intelligent and some who are not so bright, right? But which do you focus on? Which do you abstract out? You'll have some people who are hardworking and some people who are lazy, some people who are frugal and some people who spend, are not. And so you can characterize that this group's lazy, this group's cheap, this group's criminal, right? Every group of people has a range of people with different characteristics, but when we paint them with one brush, and that's where we get into negative stereotyping, sometimes positive ones too. Because you say, oh, these people are great, right? They're all brilliant, and or they're all very generous, That's people don't usually care about positive stereotypes, but they're stereotypes nonetheless.
So it's wrong to say you would say that all MAGA Republicans are out of their minds.
I would say that's wrong. As much as I tend to think that way, but I would, with general semantics, it kind of teaches you to catch yourself and say, well, wait a minute. And that's not the case because some of them are not out of their minds. They're actually very clever and using this to manipulate other people. And then there's some people who are not out of their minds. They're just not really well informed for one reason or another. And that's part of the problem. Or some of them have legitimate concerns that have brought them into that camp. And maybe we ought to think about that, those legitimate concerns. And we still may think that they're wrong for making, this move. But at the very least, let's think about what, what is their rationale? What are they thinking? So absolutely.
All right. Well, then this
And
might.
let's not, and again, let's not paint them with one brush because the people, what is a MAGA Republican? Is it just wearing the stupid hats?
No, it's much worse. But I take your point. But in that spirit, I'll share with you and our viewers and listeners a defense or at least an explanation of Elon Musk, what he's trying to do. And I have to admit, I'm not unsympathetic, I'll put it that way, to this explanation. I don't know whether it's true or not. So I'll share,
Okay.
I'll be interested in your response. And first of all, I'll begin by saying, I'm an advocate of more space travel. I
Right.
think that right, and you contributed to the book "Touching the Face of the Cosmos," et cetera, et cetera. Although you are not particularly in favor of space travel, but here's what I heard just yesterday on MSNBC. Somebody was explaining what Elon Musk is really up to in terms of what he's doing, and here's what that is. Elon Musk, just like me, thinks that the human species will never survive in the long run unless we get off this planet, not only out into the solar system, but now, the various long range telescopes have actually discovered planets circling around other stars, getting out there. In other words, getting to where Star Trek, at least after the very first in history series, which starts on Earth, uh, but where Star Trek winds up pretty quickly. So that's where Elon Musk begins.
Mhm.
Secondly, so I agree with that. Secondly, he thinks that'll never happen unless the United States is much more committed to helping that happen. No other country in the world is as reliable a launch pad of human beings getting out into space as the United States. I agree with that too. Totalitarian regimes, dictatorships might have more power, but they're not reliable. They can be snuffed out in an instant.
Right.
Democracies, okay. So, so far, those 2 points I agree with. Now, here's his third point, which I think is interesting. What he then wants to do is make this happen more than it's happening now. And the truth is, we've talked about this and you've heard me give lectures about this. Let's face it, since landing on the moon in 1969 and a few years later, we haven't done much in the space program.
Mm.
Musk thinks that's because as a country and our Congress and our former presidents have not been interested in space. They've been spending money on many, many other things. And I agree with that to some extent. And the fourth point, which sort of concludes the argument on behalf of what Musk wants, is so he feels it is absolutely necessary to shut down as many government agencies as possible to free up as much money as soon as possible to help the United States get back into the space business the way we were in the 1960s. So, so what do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I think Elon Musk ought to go to Mars, and the sooner the better. Uh, That's bottom line. And I will say that, when I wrote the piece for you, and I was um, kind of expressing the doubts that really trace back to Lewis Mumford's severe critique of the space program as just a complete waste of money and resources, where there's so much more that's needed here on planet Earth. And that I really have mixed feelings about that, because I grew up with Star Trek. And that was the future that I thought. I mean, in 2001, and I thought we would be, having family vacations on the moon and all of that kind of stuff. And so that was, turned out to be a big disappointment. And I would love to live in the future that Star Trek depicts, but uh, I don't see it. And really, with Elon Musk, I have gone over much more completely to Mumford's side on this. Frankly, if I think whoever was saying this, was it NPR, you said,
No, it was
or
on MSNBC, I think.
MSNBC,
Yeah.
whoever was saying this is an idiot, because, or Elon Musk, they're probably both idiots, but um, because first of all, he's actively destroying, working to destroy the democracy. That's the only reliable way of doing this. So that's ridiculous. Trying to set, redeploy resources into the space program will inevitably lead to massive disruptions and collapse or revolution or something really drastic. And that is a problem as well. And if we and if an asteroid suddenly comes tomorrow and brings an extinction level event, well, there's not a damn thing we can do about it, and we're near anywhere any being close to being able to do anything about it. And we have no idea. All of the indications at present are that it's very hard to survive outside of low Earth orbit once you leave the protected sheath, and are exposed to all that radiation that's out there. And so it's not a, and we don't, and it doesn't, and I think we have this image that, okay, you can like just take like let's take some corn and wheat and some cows and chickens with us, and just a few of our favorite species along with us to eat, and we'll be okay. And we don't realize the great complexity of our ecosystems, which also points to a lack of survivability. I like that kind of slogan, there is no planet B. And I'm all for pursuing this after we get ourselves, our shit together on this planet. And, after we solve the problem of climate change, for example, which is going to bring about that doom long before we can get off the off world. And after we just take care of all this stuff, because Buckminster Fuller back in like the 60s and 70s was saying, it's utopia or oblivion. We have the means to really have a wonderful global society where everyone can have enough to eat and live a comfortable life. But we're not doing that. Let's do that. And then you can then have people want to pursue this kind of thing, then they can go and do it. But let's just take care of business first, right? Take care of ourselves, our people.
I would only say partially yes. So just a brief, or partially right, a brief rejoinder. But before I do that, I just have to say I don't know if you ever talked to Neil Postman about this, but Neil knew about my interest in space. One day he said, "Paul, you don't understand. There's no air out there." So yeah, so that was his point. But
Which
the
is true. I mean, he
well,
had a way to
yeah,
get at the heart of things.
right. But okay, but this idea that we need to take care of business down here. And again, I don't want to get too much off on this tangent, but obviously we're not that far beyond the COVID pandemic. We're now beginning the worst news in the world to hear reports maybe the bird flu, is going to spring, into infecting humans. I mean, this is just really even too horrendous to imagine. But I think what history is going to say about COVID is, yeah, it was horrible. It killed millions of people, worse than the Spanish flu. Not as bad, though, as the Black Plague and the bubonic plagues, which killed as much as three-fifths of the population in some of the cities in Europe, and I think in China as well. And the only reason that COVID was tamped down was we came up with RNA vaccines.
Right.
And so this again, you and I have had this debate. I've had this debate with Neil. I remain a technological optimist. I think the worst dangers to humanity are still natural dangers. I think things like earthquakes, fires, and I know human beings obviously create a lot of the fires, but not all the fires. There were huge fires when there was hardly any industry. Floods, volcanoes. Think about those poor people in Pompeii. So and
Well,
the only
that was God's retribution for the destruction of Jerusalem.
yeah, fair enough. But Yahoo probably thinks that. So, but it seems to me that that is why we have to put
Sure.
more energy, into technology. But part of that is we do learn a lot of things going out into space. But let me
I
show
don't think we learned anything about curing diseases from
yeah.
going out into space.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure about that. I mean, it is true. I think what did we learn? We learned about Tang orange juice or something. Had a,
And pens that write upside down. Yeah.
yeah, that's helpful, right? So I was reviewed like a Star Trek movie on my blog, and I got like a whole package in the mail. Thank you so much for your support. All kinds of little Star Trek goodies, including, do I have it here? I don't know where it is. No, it's someplace else. One of those Star Trek pens that does write upside down. So
Yeah.
I should write something with it. It should come out especially good because of that. But let's let's just wrap up our discussion with one more important thing to talk about, and that's humor and jokes. And I was struck as soon as I began reading your book, and I know having heard your lectures, you're a great believer in humor. And I have to admit, I some of those jokes, like the one And again, I think it's in the first chapter. At somebody is asked to say some words at a funeral, and a guy,
Mhm.
somebody says plethora, and then the widow, do you think she would be horrified? What the hell does that mean? And the widow says it means a lot. So
That means a lot, yeah.
that means a lot. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the importance of humor in terms of the issues we've been talking about. McLuhan's point about humor is behind every joke there's a grievance, which is like a typical McLuhan point. It's true for the most part, but sometimes you really have to search
Yeah.
for the grievance. I think it's something a little different than that. So,
Well, I think McLuhan got that from Freud. Um, and that it's Joe. There's a book by Freud, "Jokes in the Unconscious." Because it's like jokes, Freudian slips, so to speak, dreams. I mean, so much of his emphasis was that things that we're trying to suppress or repress get come back out, and one of the ways that they do is in a kind of joke. But I think that McLuhan and he was so much inspired by James Joyce, and that puns are really a kind of tool that you can use for exploring and especially for understanding the etymology of a particular word. And so I really enjoy playing with words. And I hope that some of the humor, I don't know that it's universally recognized, but I mean, on that long chapter about the verb to be, there are just some jokes in there that are just I think are kind of subtle. It's not like I'm telling you a joke, it's just like a kind of funny reference. But when it comes to linguistics, as I say in that introduction, there are several. I know of several jokes about linguistics, and so I throw them in there. So the plethora one uh, was one of them. But I think they just kind of are a way to illustrate some aspects of language and often some of the sort of paradoxes or the differences in levels of abstracting. So or just the fact that there's more than one meaning that we can take from something. So when you say, uh, you know, um, I'm going to get up to say a word, and then you literally say a word, one word, and then that the word is plethora, and the response is, oh, that means a lot. Uh, it and also in that, I mean, I didn't really bring it out, but I mean, that's the nonverbal component as well. How you actually punctuate and say that means a lot or that means a lot. In print, it's not clear, and so that ambiguity works for humor as well. So, uh, yeah, I think it makes it all the sweeter. It makes it more fun for me as a writer, and I hope hopefully more enjoyable for the reader as well. At least it made you laugh, right?
absolutely. Because you're right. I mean, the way I look at it is one of the problems with general semantics is sometimes when you talk about it, it gets so quiet, you can hear a pun drop. Like, sorry.
That's really bad.
I know. I'm trying to think who came up with that. It's possible I came up with it, but somebody else might have come up with it. I've been saying that for like 100 years.
Well, at this point, no one can prove anything.
Yeah.
Um,
But I got to say, folks, who came up with? I think I mentioned this to you. Again, the first thing you have about negations and double positives, and the whole point. Someone said at some point, well, positive you can just add them on and on and on, and they never can equal a negation. And then somebody in the audience says, yeah, yeah, and that's obviously the tone of voice. But I do think that Sidney, for anyone who's reading the book, check out Sidney Morgenbesser. The late Sidney Morgenbesser was a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. Now, it's possible he wasn't telling the truth. and it's possible my memory might be slightly off, but I did take a course at Columbia. I maybe, could have been. I'm trying to think. Um, did we have to take like a research course or something when we were going for our PhD that was not in the media ecology program?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I think I took the research class at Columbia, and I was doing like philosophic research, so that's why I took the course with Morgan Besser. So I'm pretty
Mm.
sure he made that point whenever that was in the 1970s. Tell us what your next book is going to be about. If you said you have a few more, or even more than a few that you're interested in writing, you talk about that a little bit in not A, not B, and C, but maybe you can tell us
Do
more.
I?
Yeah, you say what your next books are going to be in the first chapter.
Oh,
Okay.
I don't remember doing that.
You say this is the first of two or three books that you're going to write in this area.
Well, I do intend to do at least one more, maybe a couple more for general semantics. So one of the ones that I've been working on, trying really right now, just trying to figure it out intellectually, um, is a new book that kind of, there have been books that summarize general semantics, and so Hayakawa's was the most famous. Of course, Korzybski's was the first, Science and Sanity. And in 2023, we published a sixth edition of that work, and I wrote a new preface for that. It's all comes out to close to 1,000 pages. Um, and then
What, the
Hayakawa,
preface? Not
no,
your
the
preface.
book, yeah.
Okay,
Uh,
cool.
Hayakawa's Language in Thought and Action, which is really a classic for many people. I mean, Wendell Johnson's People and Quandaries, which Postman used in the first year seminar when I was there. Um, and there have been a number of others, Irving Lee, Samuel Bois. I mean, there's, a whole set of them, including, I mean, I would include in this, although it's not presented as an introduction to general semantics, but Neil Postman's Crazy Talk, Stupid Talk was his version of that sort of thing. And there hasn't been a good one in a long, long time. And of course, for me doing it would be different. It wouldn't just be the kind of the classic, one more time, here's what general semantics is. But my way to present it would be a semantic ecology and would incorporate more than the traditional general semantics, but would also get into linguistic relativism, for example, with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and George Herbert Mead and symbolic interaction and systems theory, information theory, and other aspects of media ecology, but with centered around the core of general semantics, bringing that together. So that would be the semantic ecology book, which is probably going to be the next one that I would do. Again in this vein. Um, and the other one is that I have some other some more essays to collect, that I've been doing in general semantics and sort of like I'm thinking, well, what can I put together? And, I want to keep them from being like really, overflowing books because then they have to be so expensive and all of that. And not A, not B, and C, or not A, not B, etc., because you can pronounce the title both ways.
I see.
Um, that is not overly long, but it is in color, has which was fun to do, and that's something I want to, it's not quite the medium as the massage sort of book, but it's kind of like a step in that direction. I want to do something like that later on, but I do have a bunch of things that are politically oriented, and I left all of them out of this book and concentrated more on the sort of philosophical. There's a bit of media ecology and new media, tucked in there as well in the chapters. So you want to change the world, where I talk about, Steve Jobs and, as well as general semantics. So, but I left out the really overtly political stuff that I want to put together in a separate volume, and that one brings more Popper. The piece that I did, I don't know if you saw it, but it was published in Etc. Um, on the double bind of rational discourse in politics. The thing is that other our friends in the IGS trustees and officers, Corey Anton and Tom Gencarelli, are co-editing a collection that'll be out soon. I mean, a little later this year on politics and general semantics, and they're going to include that essay in that collection. So I'm going to wait a little longer, but I also want to it's also want to wait on to see what the hell's going on and where we are. Um, but it also includes, I did a piece that goes back to Korzybski's first book, where part of his proposal is for basically for technocratic government, which you should like, um, where the engineers should take charge, or at least, I mean, since this was published in 1921, it actually anticipates the administrative state that Elon Musk ridiculously is trying to undermine and take apart, right? Which again is against makes no sense then that he's trying to somehow bolster our space program when he's completely screwing up the idea of expertise and the administrative state. But anyway, that piece, Thorsten Veblen also had this, he wrote something, The Engineers and the Price System, that same year, around that same time, where he imagined a Soviet, back before that was a negative word. But, in other words, that the engineers, rather than the proletariat, were the ones who should take control. And that, you would have a Soviet of engineers in charge. So, uh, and then there is a piece that I did, and it was actually when I did the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture, and I kind of based it on my book, Amazing Ourselves to Death. That covers politics along with some other aspects of things. So that's all, something things I want to work on. I also have a book that I've been working on for a long time on that has to do with new media, but also about time, on cyber time, and at least another poetry collection, maybe a couple more.
All right, that sounds fabulous. A couple of final things from me. First of all, just a little bit of defense of Elon Musk here.
Musk you?
Yeah, Musk. He his point, I think, at least according to this report, is not that administrative government is bad, although unfortunately that's what the media, constantly reports. He's trying to dismantle it. The deeper point is that he thinks that too much money is being spent on things that money shouldn't be spent on, and he wants that money channeled into a government that more aggressively supports the space program. And the only reason that I have some sympathy for that point of view, and you're probably too young to remember this, is as our space program began winding down, although that's too weak a word for it, in the 1970s, after the heydays of the 60s culminating in 1969, both the Democrats and Republicans began saying, look, we need to spend more money here at home. We can't
Yeah.
keep, we beat the Russians already. We beat the Soviets, and I think that was a very bad mistake. In other words, I think that if John F. Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, if Robert F. Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, they were still talking to America in the 70s, they would have explained why you can do both. But let me just tell our audience, if you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, you will have a chance to hear more of it. Not only that, there'll be another person, Tom Gencarelli, that Lance mentioned, and we're all going to be talking about this on Wednesday, That's February 19th. Today, by the way, if you're interested, is Tuesday, February 11th. But on Wednesday, February 19th, at a place called The Players, often wrongly called the Players Club, including by me, but its true name is The Players. We, the people I just mentioned, are going to be talking with Lance about his book, and God knows what we're going to say. So check the show notes for this episode. They'll be both on YouTube and on my Light On, Light Through podcast. And you will see in the show notes a link to where you can register for this event. It's totally free, but we do ask that you register so we have some idea how many people are going to be there. We don't want the
And
place flooded with 500 people, right?
well, and the event is organized by the New York Society for General Semantics, whose president is Peggy Cassidy, and that. But it is required that you register for it.
Yeah, and I was there last February. That is February 2024. Was it March or February? I think it was maybe March, actually.
March, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, my book was published in February. I had a great time. We had a packed house. Lance and I delivered some great repartee at the beginning of the event. You can watch that on YouTube if you want to see what that looks like. So, Lance, thanks a million. We'll probably bump into each other at Fordham before next week. And again, for everybody else, I hope to see you in the audience next Wednesday at the Players. Thanks
But
again, Lance.
thank you, Paul.